Dad paid for my cousin's college but left me out. Now he wants back in my life. But I finally found out why he did this, and the truth was not what I expected. So I'm 28 now, married to my wife, Haley, and we just had our first kid about 2 months ago. A baby boy. We've been together for a while, and having our son was honestly one of the happiest moments of my life. Naturally, we were excited and shared a few photos of him on Facebook. I thought nothing of it at first, just proud to show off my kid. But looking back, I should have known better. I haven't spoken to my dad in almost 10 years, and somehow my relatives took those photos and sent them to him. It's funny how people just can't mind their own business. Let me back up a bit to explain why me and my dad aren't exactly on speaking terms. It all goes back to when I finished high school, and things were supposed to be looking up for me. I was ready for college. I had decent grades, not top of the class or anything, but I worked hard, and I was really excited to take the next step. I wasn't expecting a handout, but I figured my dad would at least help me out with tuition, especially since he was doing pretty well for himself. Here's the thing. My cousin Peter, who's only a few months younger than me, was always around growing up. We were basically raised together, and while we were close at times, there was always this weird competition between us, almost like we were brothers, but not really. The truth is, my dad always seemed to have a soft spot for Peter. I'm not sure when I first noticed it, but it became pretty clear over the years that Peter got the better end of the deal whenever my dad was involved. Now, Peter didn't exactly have an easy life. His parents, my uncle and aunt, were always struggling to keep their cafe afloat. They were decent people, just constantly busy with their business and didn't have much time for him. So my dad stepped in. He'd take Peter out for stuff, help him with school, and was generally more present for him than Peter's own parents. I didn't think much of it back then because, I had my dad full-time. It was just me and him since my mom left when I was a baby. So I guess I assumed that made me his number one priority. Boy, was I wrong. High school wasn't easy for either of us, but I worked my ass off to keep my grades up. I was doing all right. Better than Peter, actually. Peter was struggling, especially in math. I spent hours tutoring myself while Peter got help from my dad. There were times I'd look over and see my dad sitting with him at the kitchen table, going over algebra, and I'd wonder why he didn't do that with me. But I let it slide, thinking, well, Peter needs the help more. Things didn't really blow up until after we graduated. That's when the whole college thing came up. I was already stressing about how to pay for it. Like I said, I didn't expect my dad to cover the whole thing, but I figured he'd help me out at least a little bit. I even looked up scholarships and part-time jobs, trying to figure out how to make it all work. Then, my dad drops a bomb on me. We were sitting in the living room one night, and I asked him about college. Just a casual conversation, really. I was ready to talk about what schools I was looking at and what I might major in. But before I even got into it, my dad cut me off and said, "Michael, I think you should look into getting scholarships. I'm not going to be able to pay for your tuition." I just sat there, stunned. I didn't know how to respond at first because I wasn't expecting that. It wasn't like my dad was broke or struggling. He was doing well in his job, living comfortably, and I wasn't asking for the world, just some help. So I asked him why. I said, "Why can't you help me? You know how important college is to me?" He shrugged, and that's when he told me something I'll never forget. "I'm covering Peter's tuition," he said, like it was no big deal. Like I should have seen it coming. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, I knew my dad had been helping Peter's family for years. He'd lend them money here and there to keep their cafe running, but this? Paying for Peter's college instead of mine? It felt like a slap in the face. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream, so I just sat there, stunned. After a minute of awkward silence, I asked, "Why him and not me? I'm your son." My dad sighed, like he was tired of explaining it to me, and said, "Peter's family is going through a tough time right now. They can't afford to send him to college, and I need to help them. You can get a scholarship or student loans. You'll figure it out. Besides, Peter's like a brother to you. You should want to help him." At that moment, I felt my blood boil. I snapped back, "He's not my brother. He's my cousin. Why are you acting like he's your son?" My dad's face went cold. He stood up, crossed his arms, and looked at me like I was some stranger. "If you're going to have that attitude, maybe it's time you find somewhere else to stay," he said. And that was it. My dad had made his choice. He chose Peter over me, and I was out. I didn't even have time to pack properly. I grabbed some stuff and left, crashing at a friend's place for a while. I had no plan, no idea what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let my dad's decision ruin my life. For the next few weeks, I scrambled to find a way to pay for school. I applied for loans, scholarships, anything I could think of. But without my dad's support, none of it worked out. I couldn't afford tuition, rent, food, all the basics. So I did what I had to do. I dropped out before I even started. College wasn't happening for me. It hurt like hell, especially knowing Peter was off living the dream my dad handed him on a silver platter. That was when I realized my relationship with my dad was never going to be the same. He made his choice, and it wasn't me. From that moment on, I decided I wasn't going to rely on anyone but myself. If my own dad couldn't have my back, then I'd figure things out on my own. And that's exactly what I did. I didn't have a plan. All I knew was I wasn't going back to my dad's place. I felt completely abandoned. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was the fact that my own dad didn't see me as his priority. He'd made his decision, and that decision was Peter. I wasn't exactly swimming in options. College was out of the picture, and with no backup plan, I had to find work fast. I couldn't just stay on my friend's couch forever, so I started looking for jobs. Problem was, without a college degree, the jobs I could get weren't exactly going to pay the bills. Every job I found either paid next to nothing or expected me to work insane hours for peanuts. I was desperate though, so I took whatever I could find. I ended up landing this temp gig at a warehouse. The pay was garbage, but at least it was something. I'd be working long hours, sweating my ass off, lifting boxes and doing all kinds of grunt work. The kind of stuff you do when you don't really have any other choice. It sucked, but I didn't have any room to be picky. During this time, my dad tried to reach out. He sent me a couple of texts, nothing too deep, just the usual, "How are you doing?" or "You can come home anytime." But here's the thing. He never mentioned anything about helping me with school. Not once did he say, "Let's figure this out," or "I'll help you with your tuition." It was like that part of the conversation never happened, and I was just supposed to forget about it. Like we could go back to normal without fixing anything. I wasn't having it. I ignored his messages, convinced that if he couldn't even acknowledge what he did, then there was no point in talking. How do you just pretend that you didn't screw over your own kid? I couldn't get over it. Every time I thought about Peter going off to college, living in a dorm, doing the whole campus life thing while I was stuck in a warehouse, it made my blood boil. And my dad was the one who made that choice. But life goes on, right? At least that's what everyone kept telling me. I tried to just keep my head down and focus on work, but it wasn't easy. Every day was a grind. The job was exhausting and I was barely scraping by. I had rent to pay, groceries to buy, and bills stacking up, all while trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with my life now that college wasn't an option. I couldn't see a way out of the hole I was in, and honestly, I started feeling pretty low. It didn't help that I was completely on my own. My dad wasn't there, and neither were my uncle or aunt. They didn't reach out to check on me once, which just confirmed what I already knew. They didn't care. Peter was their golden child, and I was just there. Forgotten. It was like I didn't exist anymore, except when my dad wanted to send a half-assed text pretending like everything was fine. But here's the thing. Even though I felt like crap, I knew I had to keep going. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't just sit around feeling sorry for myself. So I worked my ass off at that temp job, saving up whatever little money I could. I had this mindset that if no one was going to help me, I'd just have to do it myself. I wasn't about to let my dad's decision define my life. After a few months of grinding, I finally got lucky. The company I was working for offered me a permanent position. It wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was stable, and the pay was a little better. It was something, and I was relieved to have at least some stability in my life. The job came with benefits too, which was a big deal for me at the time because I didn't have health insurance or anything like that. So, for the first time in a while, I felt like things were starting to look up, even if it wasn't the life I had imagined for myself. During all this, I was still pissed at my dad, and that anger kept me going in a weird way. I didn't want to prove him right by failing. If he was going to bet on Peter, fine, but I was going to make something of myself, even if I had to drag myself there. I kept my distance from my dad, didn't respond to any of his messages, and didn't look back. I figured, if he couldn't be there for me when I needed him most, then I didn't need him now that I was trying to figure things out on my own. Meanwhile, I started hearing through the grapevine that Peter was doing well in college. He'd send updates to the family about his grades, his new friends, all that college experience stuff I never got to have. And my dad would gush about it to anyone who would listen. Every time someone told me how proud my dad was of Peter, it felt like another punch in the gut. My own dad couldn't even say he was proud of me for holding my life together. But Peter? He was like the second coming of Christ in my dad's eyes. That's when it really hit me. My dad didn't just choose Peter's education over mine. He chose Peter, period. He was more proud of what Peter was doing than anything I had done. And that hurt like hell. I started to feel like maybe my dad never really cared about me the way a dad should. I don't know if he ever did, or if I was just too blind to see it growing up. Either way, it was obvious now. Peter had replaced me, and I had to learn to live with that. I kept grinding at my job, slowly working my way up. It wasn't the most exciting life, but I had a roof over my head, and I was doing it on my own. I didn't need anyone's help, least of all my dad's. And honestly, that started to feel like its own kind of victory. I didn't need to go to college to make something of myself. I was proving that with hard work, you can get by, even when the odds are stacked against you. Still, every time I thought about what my life could have been like if my dad had just helped me out a little, it pissed me off all over again. But I guess that's just part of the deal. You live with the choices people make for you, and you either let them define you, or you figure out a way to rise above it. I wasn't going to let my dad's choice ruin me, even if it meant carrying that anger around with me for a long time. I was determined to keep going, and no matter how much it hurt, I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me fail. A few years down the line, things started to change. I was still working at the warehouse, but I'd put in enough time and effort that I wasn't just some temp worker anymore. I'd gotten promoted to a more stable position, and while it wasn't exactly my dream job, it was something I could be proud of. I was finally making enough money to live comfortably, not just paycheck to paycheck like before. It felt like all those long hours, the sleepless nights, and just pushing through had finally paid off. The job came with some decent benefits too: health insurance, a retirement plan, stuff I never thought about back when I was younger. But now it was the kind of security I'd been desperate for. I wasn't rolling in money or anything, but I wasn't drowning in bills anymore, and that made a huge difference. For the first time in a while, I felt like I had some control over my life again. Around this time, I met Haley. It was kind of random, honestly. She was working in a different department at the same company, and we crossed paths in the break room one day. I didn't think much of it at first, just a casual chat over crappy coffee. But one thing led to another, and we started talking more and more until it became something real. We clicked in a way that felt easy, and before long, we were dating. Being with Haley made me realize just how much of my energy I'd been putting into being angry about my dad. She was like this breath of fresh air, someone who made me feel like I didn't have to keep proving myself to the world or carrying around all that bitterness. She didn't care about where I went to school or that I didn't go to school at all. She just saw me for who I was. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Of course, while all this was happening, my dad kept trying to reach out. His texts never stopped, but they were always surface level. Stuff like, "Happy birthday, hope you're doing well," or "Merry Christmas, miss you." But every time I just couldn't bring myself to respond. It's not that I didn't think about it. I'd stare at those texts for a while sometimes, wondering if I should just let it go and reach back out. But then I'd remember how he never apologized, never even acknowledged what he did, and all the anger would come flooding back. It's funny because by this point, I wasn't struggling anymore. I wasn't the broke kid who had to drop out of college and work whatever temp job I could find. I was doing okay. Better than okay, actually. I had a stable job, my own place, and Haley, who made everything in life feel brighter. But none of that erased the fact that my dad had chosen Peter over me when it really counted. I don't think anything could erase that. Speaking of Peter, I heard bits and pieces about him through the family grapevine. He'd graduated college and gotten a job, but from what I gathered, it wasn't the high-paying career my dad had probably envisioned for him. Apparently, he was struggling a bit, not making much money and living in a small apartment with his girlfriend. I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel like some kind of justice. Here I was, the kid who got left behind, and I was doing better than the golden child my dad had poured all his support into. It wasn't like I was keeping tabs on Peter, but people talk. Family members who I hadn't spoken to in years would randomly bring him up in conversation, usually trying to get me to reconnect with my dad. They'd say things like, "You know, Peter's not doing so great. You should talk to your dad. He misses you." But every time I heard that, it just reminded me why I kept my distance in the first place. My dad made his choice and I made mine. Haley was always super supportive during this time. She never pushed me to talk to my dad or made me feel guilty for cutting him off. In fact, she was the one who told me I didn't owe him anything. That was a game changer for me because, up until then, I'd always felt this pressure to eventually forgive him, like it was something I had to do because he was my dad. But Haley helped me see that I wasn't responsible for fixing the mess he created. That mindset shift made a big difference in how I approach my life. I stopped feeling like I was waiting for my dad to come around or for some magical moment where everything would get resolved. Instead, I focused on what I had in front of me: my job, my relationship with Haley, and the life we were building together. And things just got better from there. After a couple of years, I proposed to Haley. It wasn't some big elaborate thing. We weren't those people who needed a fancy dinner or an Instagram-worthy proposal. I just took her to a park we used to walk through on our lunch breaks, and I asked her. She said yes, of course, and we got married a few months later in a small ceremony. Just close friends and a few family members. It was perfect. And I didn't think about my dad once that day. Our life together was simple, but it was ours. We moved into a decent apartment, got a dog, and talked about starting a family someday. I finally felt like I'd made it, in my own way. I didn't need my dad's approval or his money. Everything I had I'd worked for, and I was proud of that. Of course, my dad didn't stop trying to reach out. He sent a message when he found out I got married saying something like, "I'm so happy for you and Haley. I wish I could have been there." It was almost laughable to me because, again, no mention of an apology. No acknowledgement of what went down between us. Just him acting like he should have been part of my life all along. I didn't respond. I didn't see the point. How do you let someone back in when they don't even recognize the damage they caused? It wasn't just about the money or the college thing anymore. It was about the fact that he never saw me as his priority, and nothing had changed in all the years since. So I kept living my life. Haley and I eventually decided we were ready to start a family, and that's when we had our son. He's the best thing that's ever happened to me, and holding him for the first time made me realize how much I wanted to be the kind of dad I never had. I'm not perfect, and I'm sure I'll mess up sometimes, but I know for sure I'll never make my kid feel like he comes second to anyone else. A few days after we posted the pictures of our son on Facebook, my phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw my dad's name pop up. It was like the universe was testing me. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 10 years, and suddenly, there he was, reaching out after seeing pictures of my son. Part of me wanted to just ignore it, like I had with all his texts before, but another part of me was curious. Maybe this was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment where he finally said he was sorry. Maybe becoming a grandfather would make him realize what he'd lost. So I picked up the phone. "Hey, Michael," he said, his voice almost hesitant, like he wasn't sure how I'd react. I stayed quiet for a second, waiting to see what he'd say next. He kept talking, going on about how much he missed me, how hard it's been not being in my life, and how he felt bad for not being at my wedding. All the while I was just sitting there, listening but not really feeling anything. It was all empty words. Then he brought up the pictures of my son. "I saw the pictures of your little boy. He's beautiful, Michael. I'm really proud of you." That's when I snapped. "Proud of me?" I shot back. "You're proud of me now after everything? You weren't there for any of it. You didn't help me with college. You chose Peter over me, your own son, and now you're proud of me?" The silence on the other end of the line was thick. I could tell he didn't expect that reaction, but I wasn't done. "You've never even apologized for what you did," I continued, my voice rising. "You threw me aside like I didn't matter, and now you want to come back into my life like nothing happened?" He started to respond, but I cut him off. "You know what? Maybe Peter is your real son. You treated him like one all those years. Maybe you and Aunt Susan were more than just family." I threw it out there, more to hurt him than anything else. I didn't believe it, not really. I just wanted him to feel as crappy as I did. But here's the thing. I expected him to get mad, to yell back, to defend himself. Instead, there was this long pause on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, he sounded confused. "Michael, what are you talking about?" he said, almost like he was struggling to process what I'd just said. His reaction caught me off guard. I was waiting for him to blow up, but instead, he sounded lost. For a second, I thought I might have hit something real, something I wasn't supposed to know. "Don't play dumb with me," I said, but my voice had lost some of its edge. I was starting to wonder if I'd just stumbled onto something bigger. "I see how you've always treated Peter like your favorite. Maybe there's a reason for that." There was another long pause, and I could hear him breathing like he was trying to figure out what to say. "Michael, that's not true," he said quietly. I don't know why you'd think that." But the way he said it, the hesitation in his voice, it didn't sit right with me. Suddenly, I wasn't so sure I'd just made it up. I'd thrown that out there to hurt him, but his reaction wasn't what I expected. It was like he was genuinely confused, but at the same time, It felt like maybe there was something there that even he hadn't considered. I didn't know what to do with that. I'd been so sure of what I was saying, so sure that I was just lashing out, but now I wasn't sure of anything. The thought that my dad could have been cheating with his brother's wife was something I hadn't really believed until that moment. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there was more to the story. "You don't know, do you?" I said, half accusing, half questioning. "Maybe you've been lying to yourself this whole time." "Michael, that's enough," he said, his voice more firm now. "I don't know what's going on in your head, but that's not what happened. I loved your mom, and I would never do something like that to my brother." But the damage was done. His confusion, the way he stumbled over his words, it planted a seed of doubt in my mind. I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. I didn't trust him, not after everything. But now there was this nagging thought in the back of my mind that maybe I'd uncovered something real. "I don't even know what to believe anymore," I muttered. "But I do know one thing. You still haven't apologized for any of it. For choosing Peter over me. For making me feel like I didn't matter." "I'm sorry," he said quickly, almost too quickly. "I'm sorry you feel that way." I hated that phrase. Sorry you feel that way. It wasn't an apology. It was just another way of deflecting responsibility. I let out a bitter laugh. "That's not an apology, Dad. That's just you trying to avoid the truth." He tried to say something else, but I'd had enough. "Look," I said, cutting him off. "I don't know what's real anymore, and honestly, I don't care. The fact is you hurt me. You made your choice a long time ago, and it wasn't me." "I want to make it right, Michael," he said, almost pleading now. "I don't know how, but I want to." I didn't know what to say to that. I was still reeling from the thought that maybe, just maybe, my dad's connection to Peter was deeper than I'd ever realized. But even if that wasn't true, it didn't change the fact that my dad had failed me. I didn't need him in my life to remind me of all the ways he'd let me down. "I need time to think," I said finally. "I don't know if I can trust you. Not after everything. I'm not saying it's impossible, but don't expect anything soon." We ended the call not long after that, and I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Did I really believe my dad had cheated with his brother's wife? I wasn't sure. But his reaction had opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. All I knew for sure was that things were even more complicated than I thought. Update. After that call with my dad, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, what I said wasn't completely off base. It started as me trying to hurt him, throwing out the accusation that Peter might actually be his son. Not just my cousin, but the way he reacted, hesitant, confused. It was like he didn't know how to respond, and that got to me. I hadn't spoken to my dad in almost a decade, so maybe I didn't know everything about him anymore. Could there be some truth to what I said? I'm not in contact with my dad, and I don't go to family gatherings. So, figuring this out wasn't going to be as simple as talking to people face to face. I started digging into memories instead, thinking back on things that hadn't crossed my mind in years. There were these late nights when my aunt, Peter's mom, would show up at our house. I must have been 8 or 9 years old at the time. She would always have some excuse, dropping something off, checking in on us. But it was odd how often she came by when my uncle wasn't around. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But now those late night visits seemed suspicious. I remember my dad would act differently when she was there, like he was on edge. He'd send me to bed early or make sure I wasn't around while they talked. Sometimes I'd catch them whispering in the kitchen, but I never overheard anything. At the time, it all seemed so normal. Adults talking about adult things. But now I was starting to wonder what those conversations were really about. Piece by piece, the puzzle started coming together in my head. My dad's over-the-top favoritism towards Peter. The way he would always defend Peter, no matter what. And the fact that he never showed me the same kind of support. It wasn't just because Peter's family was struggling financially. Maybe it was because Peter was more than just his nephew. I started looking for anything that could give me a clearer picture. I dug through old family photos, trying to spot something, anything that could confirm my suspicion. I even reached out to a couple of old family friends, subtly asking about those years when my aunt used to come by the house. I didn't ask directly, of course. I didn't want to raise any red flags, but no one had any answers. Everything seemed to point back to the same place. I was on my own in figuring this out. The more I thought about it, the more it all added up. I remembered a time when my dad went out of his way to defend Peter, even when Peter was clearly in the wrong. We were teenagers, and Peter had gotten into some trouble at school. Nothing major, but enough that we both got punished. My dad's reaction was bizarre. He wasn't angry at Peter like I thought he would be. Instead, he kept telling me to go easy on him, to understand that Peter had a different kind of pressure on him. At the time, I thought he was just being protective, but now I see it in a whole new light. I didn't need a DNA test to confirm what I already knew deep down. Peter was my dad's son. It was the only explanation that made sense. The late-night visits, the way my dad treated him, the years of favoritism, it all pointed to the same truth. But now that I knew, I didn't know what to do with it. Should I confront my dad again? Should I tell my uncle the truth? The thought of telling my uncle made me sick to my stomach. He had no idea that the kid he raised as his son wasn't really his. I couldn't imagine how devastating that would be for him. My uncle isn't a bad guy. He worked hard, took care of his family, and loved Peter like his own. Telling him the truth would tear his world apart. And what about Peter? He didn't know either. As much as I resented him growing up, he didn't deserve to find out his whole life was built on a lie. He didn't ask for any of this. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that telling the truth wouldn't make things better for anyone. It would just cause more pain. For now, I've decided to keep it to myself. I don't know if that's the right choice, but it's the one I'm going with. Maybe one day I'll tell my uncle. Or maybe I'll take this secret to my grave. But right now, I don't see the point in blowing up everyone's life over something that happened years ago. My relationship with my dad is already broken, and knowing the truth isn't going to fix that. It's a heavy burden to carry, knowing that Peter is my dad's son and that no one else knows the truth. But what good would it do to tell them? My dad made his choices and I've made mine. Maybe keeping this secret is my way of taking control of a situation that was never really in my hands to begin with. I still don't know what to think about my dad. Part of me wonders if he even knows for sure that Peter is his son. Maybe he's been lying to himself all these years, or maybe he's just as clueless as everyone else. Either way, it doesn't change the fact that he failed me as a father. Whether or not Peter is his biological son, the way he treated me is something I can't forgive. For now, I'm at peace with keeping the truth to myself. It's not my job to fix the mess my dad created, and it's not my job to blow up my uncle's life. Maybe one day I'll decide differently, but today I'm choosing silence.